Help me. Please, God, help me. They were going to kill my baby. Silas Pendleton heard those words through 3 inches of solid oak and 40 years of trying to forget what blood smelled like. His hand was already on the door before his brain finished processing the sound. What he found on the other side would drag him back into the only world he'd ever truly known and remind him at 72 years old that some men are never really done being soldiers. If this is your first time, here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single word of this matters. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. Silas knew the exact time because he'd been watching the clock above the fireplace, the way old men watch clocks when sleep won't come, and the wind is doing things outside that sound almost human. The storm had been building since early evening, the kind of October storm that northern Arizona threw at you like a personal insult, not just rain but cold and fury, and that particular howling that made the pines sound like they were in pain. He'd been sitting in his armchair with a cup of coffee gone cold, and Barnaby's heavy head resting on his left foot, the dogs breathing slow and warm and reassuring in the way that only a dog's breathing can be. 3 legs and 11 years old, Barnaby had long since stopped reacting to storms. He'd heard enough of them. They both had. The knock didn't just knock, it hammered. 3 hard blows, then a pause, then 2 more, and something in the pattern, the desperation of it, the irregularity, the unmistakable cadence of a person who wasn't sure they had enough left in them to knock again pulled Silas up from his chair before he'd made a conscious decision to move. Barnaby lifted his head. Silas was already at the door. He didn't open it immediately. 40 years of ingrained survival habit made him step to the side, put his back against the wall and say, "Who's there?" His voice came out steady. It always did. That was one of the things the Army had given him that he could never give back, the ability to sound calm when everything in his chest was the opposite of calm. "Please." The voice on the other side was female, young, shaking so badly the word came out in pieces. "Please, I need help. I'm hurt. Please." He heard something else under the word, something wet, something effortful, the sound of a person breathing through pain. His hand found the deadbolt. His other hand found the 12-gauge he kept mounted on the wall beside the door, not because he was a paranoid man, but because he was a practical one, and living 40 minutes from the nearest town on an unpaved mountain road had a way of clarifying your thinking about personal security. He opened the door. She fell into him. Not metaphorically. She literally fell at the door, swinging inward and her body coming with it, and Silas caught her with both arms and the shotgun clattered to the floor, and Barnaby was suddenly on his feet, making a sound he'd never made before. Not a bark, not a growl, but something low and urgent, like the dog understood immediately that this was different from anything they'd encountered in their quiet life together. She was blonde, young, mid-20s at most, and soaked through to the bone. She wore a pale blue maternity dress that had been expensive once, and her hair was plastered against a face that was bruised on the left side, a split in her lower lip still oozing, and her hands, when they grabbed his forearms, were trembling so violently he could feel it in his teeth. And she was pregnant, enormously, visibly, impossibly pregnant, the kind of pregnant where you stopped counting weeks and started counting hours. "I've got you," Silas said. "I've got you. Don't fight me." He pulled her inside, kicked the door shut with his heel, and guided her to the couch. She let him mostly. Her legs gave out halfway across the room, and he took her weight without complaint, his old body remembering things his mind had spent years trying to put away. "They're coming," she said, "and they're right behind me. You have to lock the door. You have to, already locked." He eased her down onto the couch. "Look at me, look at my face. What's your name?" She was looking past him at the door at the window, at all the darkness pressing against the glass. "Hey." He put 2 fingers gently under her chin and turned her face toward his. "Name. Tell me your name." Her eyes found his. They were green and they were terrified, and underneath the terror, there was something else. Something that recognized him as a fixed point in a world that had gone completely sideways. "Chloe," she said. "Chloe Callahan. Chloe, I'm Silas. You're inside, you're out of the storm, and I need you to let me look at you. Can you do that?" She nodded. Barely. He pulled the floor lamp closer and started his assessment the way he'd done 10,000 times, hands first. Eyes moving fast, cataloging without reacting, the internal monologue of a man trained to see everything and show nothing. Bruising on the face, defensive wounds on her forearms, her left side held differently than her right. A hand pressed to her ribs like she was trying to hold something in. He moved her hand. The wet he'd heard in her breathing made sudden horrible sense. The left side of her dress, from just below the armpit to somewhere around her hip, was dark. Not storm-wet dark, a different dark entirely. His jaw set. "You've been shot." "Yes." The word came out almost conversational, like she'd already processed that fact and moved past the shock of it into some survivalist place beyond. "How long ago?" Maybe an hour, I don't know. I drove as long as I could, and then the road washed out, and I walked." She looked down at herself. "I walked a long way." An hour. She'd been bleeding for an hour in a storm on a washed-out mountain road, heavily pregnant, and she'd walked to his door. The part of him that had spent 30 years in emergency medicine did the math automatically, clinically, and the answer was grim enough that he kept it behind his teeth. "I need to get your dress off your shoulder so I can see the wound," he told her. "I'm going to be fast, and I'm going to be careful. Nod if that's okay." She nodded. He was fast. He was careful. He'd done this in the backs of helicopters, and the floors of field hospitals, and the chaotic wards of trauma centers, and he did it now with the same deliberate efficiency, working the fabric away from the wound with hands that did not shake. The bullet had entered from the side between the 6th and 7th ribs. He could tell that much immediately. The exit wound was his concern. He rolled her slightly gently, and she hissed between her teeth, but didn't cry out, and he checked. Exit wound present. That was good. That meant the bullet wasn't still in there doing damage he couldn't see. What wasn't good was the location. "Deep breath for me," he said. She breathed. He listened, his ear closed, the old way, the way you listened before you had machines to do it for you. Both lungs moving. That was something. The wound was bleeding, but the bleeding had slowed, which meant either the cold had helped or something physiological had stepped in. And right now he chose to accept that as a mercy rather than examine it too closely. "Okay," he said. He straightened up and looked at her directly. "Here's what I know. The bullet went through. You're losing blood, but you haven't lost enough to you're stable right now. Right now, that can change." "What about the baby?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Just fractured, right down the middle of head." "Tell me your due date." 3 weeks. "He's 3 weeks early, but the doctor said she said he was big. She said he was ready." She grabbed Silas's wrist, her grip surprisingly powerful for a woman who should have had nothing left. "Don't let him die. Whatever happens to me, don't let him die." "Nobody's dying tonight," Silas said. He said it with the specific authority of a man who had made that promise hundreds of times under circumstances that would have made lesser people weep, and he meant it the way he'd always meant it, not as a guarantee, but as a declaration of intent. "But I need you to be straight with me about everything. Who shot you?" She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, something moved behind her eyes. Calculation, fear, and something he could only describe as a specific kind of loyalty that ran so deep it was almost its own kind of love. "Men," she said. "Men in black cars." "How many?" "3 cars. Maybe 8, 10 men." A pause. "They weren't supposed to find us. We were coming back from my sister's, just me and my driver, and they were already there on the road like they knew." Her voice tightened. "They killed Marcus, my driver. He died so I could get away." Silas absorbed this. "And they're following you here." I don't know if they saw which way I went." She turned to look at the window again. "But they don't give up. They never give up." "Who are they?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Chloe." He kept his voice level. "I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm protecting you from." She looked at him then with a directness that was almost startling, like she'd made a decision, a real one, the kind you can't take back. "My husband is Tommy Callahan." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Silas had lived in northern Arizona for 11 years. Before that, he'd worked trauma at Phoenix General for 12 years. He knew the name Tommy Callahan the way everyone in the state knew it, not from the news exactly, and not from the police reports, but from the particular kind of weight that some names carried in certain places. Tommy Callahan was the president of the Arizona chapter. And the Arizona chapter was Hell's Angels. Silas stood very still for a moment, Barnaby sensing something pressed against his leg. All right, Silas said. He did not change his tone. He did not step back. He looked at this bleeding, pregnant, terrified young woman on his couch, and he made a rapid, clear-eyed decision about what kind of man he was going to be in the next several hours. All right, then we've got work to do. He moved to the kitchen, said fast, pulling open the cabinet above the refrigerator where he kept the medical kit. Not a first aid kit, not the little red plastic box with the cartoon bandages that civilians kept in their bathrooms. A real kit, a kit built by a man who had never fully accepted that his days of needing one were over. Hemostatic gauze, surgical tape, irrigation syringes, IV setup, suture kit, compression bandages. He'd restocked it 4 months ago, almost out of habit, and had felt vaguely foolish doing so at the time. He didn't feel foolish now. Do you have a phone? He called back to her. They shot it. In the car. It was on the seat and they... Never mind. His own landline had gone out with the storm. He'd checked it an hour ago. The satellite phone was in the truck, which was parked 50 yards from the cabin. 50 yards in this storm felt like a calculation he wasn't ready to make yet. He came back to the living room with both arms full and set everything on the coffee table. Barnaby had positioned himself beside the couch, his nose working, and Chloe's hand had dropped to rest on the dog's head with the instinctiveness of a person who needed to hold on to something living. He won't hurt you, Silas said. I know, she said softly. He's already helping. Silas unwrapped the hemostatic gauze and knelt beside her. This is going to hurt. I need to pack the wound. Do you understand what that means? Do it. I need you to. I said do it. He did it. She made a sound like someone had hit her with a closed fist, short, sharp, involuntary, and then she locked her jaw and went silent, and he worked quickly, efficiently packing the wound to stop the bleeding, securing it with tape and compression, talking her through each step in the low, steady voice he'd developed in Vietnam and never lost. When he was done, he sat back and looked at her. She was pale, much paler than when she'd walked in, but her eyes were still focused, still tracking, still present. Good, he said. You did good. My mother always said I had a high pain tolerance, a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. She said it like it was a bad thing. Right now, it's the best thing you've got. He pulled the armchair close to the couch and sat down, bringing himself to her eye level. I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Okay. When did your contractions start? The question hung in the air. Chloe's expression shifted, a complex sequence of emotions crossing her face in rapid succession. Something like denial, followed by recognition, followed by fear, followed by a terrible, quiet acceptance. About 45 minutes ago, she said, I thought it was the stress. I thought if I could just get somewhere safe, they'd stop. Silas looked at her for a long moment. How far apart? She swallowed. They were every 12 minutes in the car, but in the last 2 have been closer. How close? Maybe 8 minutes. He stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the storm, at the rain coming sideways, at the trees bending in ways that seemed to contradict the laws of physics, at the road beyond the tree line that was invisible in the darkness. No headlights? Not yet. He turned back around. All right, Chloe, I'm going to be honest with you because you strike me as someone who handles honesty better than the alternative. Yes, you're in active labor. Your wound is packed and stabilized, but it's serious and it needs a surgeon within the next several hours. I cannot get you to a hospital tonight. The road is washed out and the storm isn't breaking until morning. He let her absorb that. But I have delivered babies before, not recently, but not so long ago that I've forgotten how. And right now, tonight, I am what you've got. She held his gaze. How many babies? Including the field deliveries. Sure, somewhere around 60. Something moved in her expression, a slight softening, not relief exactly, but the beginning of trust, which in that moment was more valuable than relief. Then I guess we're having a baby, she said. Silas allowed himself one single beat, one moment of acknowledging the profound absurdity and weight of what was happening in this small cabin in the middle of a mountain storm. Then he put that moment away, locked it somewhere he'd deal with later, and became the man he'd spent 40 years being. I need clean towels, hot water, my second kit from the hall closet, and another 20 minutes of you not going into transition, he said, moving again. Let's see which of those I can actually manage. He was halfway to the hall when she said, Silas. He stopped. Why are you doing this? Her voice was stripped of everything. The bravery, the toughness, the composed front she'd been holding up since she fell through his door. Underneath all of it was just a young woman, frightened and hurting and a long way from home. You don't know me. You don't know what I am, what my husband is. You could have just not answered the door. He stood there for a second in the hallway. I was a combat medic for 8 years, he said finally, and a trauma nurse for 30 after that. You want to know why I'm doing this? He looked back at her over his shoulder. Because there is no version of me that doesn't answer that door. He went to get the kit. Behind him, Barnaby settled his chin on Chloe's knee, and outside, above the fury of the storm, something moved in the darkness of the mountain road. 2 points of light, very far away, getting closer. Silas didn't see them yet, but somewhere in the back of his mind, in that old soldier's place where instinct lived a part of him that had kept him alive through things that should have killed him, something stirred. He moved faster. The 2 points of light on the mountain road didn't move like lost travelers. Silas saw them the second time he crossed to the window carrying his second kit and a stack of towels, and he stopped walking the moment his eyes registered what they were doing. Not wandering, not slowing at the washout, moving deliberately carefully the way people moved when they knew exactly where they were going and didn't care how bad the road was. He set the kit down on the kitchen table without taking his eyes off the window. Chloe. He kept his voice the same temperature it had been all night. The men who came after you described the vehicles. She'd been watching him from the couch, tracking his movements, the way injured people track their caretaker, measuring safety by proximity. Black SUVs, big ones, tinted windows. All 3 of them. Yes, why? He turned away from the window. No reason yet. He came back to her and crouched down, opening the second kit across the coffee table. The lie was a kind one, and he figured she'd earned it. She had a gunshot wound and active labor to manage. She didn't need to add incoming threat to the list. Not for another few minutes anyway. Talk to me about your contractions, he said. Be exact. She shifted one hand going to her side, the other pressed flat against her abdomen. They're 7 minutes apart now, and they're different than before. Stronger. Different how, Before in the car, it was like pressure. Now it's like, she stopped and looked at him with an expression that mixed pain and dark humor in a way that shouldn't have been possible given the circumstances. Like my body decided it was done asking permission. That's transition. He unwrapped a blood pressure cuff from the kit. Your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The problem is the timing. Story of my life. He wrapped the cuff around her arm and pumped it. The reading came back low. Not catastrophic, but low enough that the wound was clearly still taking a toll, and the combination of blood loss and labor on a body already pushed to its limit was a calculation that had exactly one acceptable answer. Keep moving. Stay ahead of it. Don't let the numbers win. I need an IV in you, he said. I've got Ringer's lactate in the kit. It's going to help with the blood pressure and keep you from bottoming out when labor intensifies. You have Ringer's lactate in your kit. I restock every 4 months. She stared at him. Who are you? Someone who couldn't stop being a medic no matter how hard he tried. He uncapped the IV line. Give me your arm, left one. She extended her arm without further argument, and he found the vein on the first try the hands remembered, even now, even after all the years of no-call nights and quiet mornings with bad coffee and a 3-legged dog. The muscle memory was the last thing that left a man. Sometimes he thought it might never leave at all. He taped the line down, hung the bag from the lamp hook above the couch, and stood up. I need you to tell me something, Chloe said, watching the drip. Depends on what it is. Are those headlights on the road? He looked at her for one beat, then, yes. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were clear, resolved. How far? Far enough, but not far enough to pretend they're not there. He went to the window, looked out, and the 2 lights had become 4. A second vehicle pulled behind the first. Both of them navigating the mountain road with the slow, purposeful patience of men who weren't worried about being followed because they were the ones doing the following. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Silas said, still at the window. I'm going to prepare this cabin. That means some things are going to happen that might sound alarming. Drawers opening, things moving. I need you to focus on your breathing and let me work. Can you do that? What are you preparing? For the fact that we might have company. He turned from the window. And for the fact that whatever happens when they get here, I am not leaving your side until that baby is safe. Something crossed her face, then not gratitude exactly, and not surprise, but something deeper and older than both of those things. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who had spent years surrounded by men who understood loyalty as a transaction, finally meeting one who understood it as a value. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, Silas. He moved. He went first to the gun cabinet in the bedroom, the one he kept locked, not because he feared thieves, but because he respected what was inside. He came out with the 12 gauge he dropped when she fell through the door, now reloaded in a Colt 45 that he'd carried in 2 wars and never once been glad he didn't have. He set them both within reach of his primary position, the armchair pulled to face both the door and Chloe simultaneously, and then he went back to the medical kit and started laying out everything he was going to need. Because the other reality, the one running parallel to the security reality, was this. She was going to deliver this baby tonight, in this cabin, in this storm, and no amount of armed men and SUVs changed that biological fact. 2 crises, 1 man, 0 backup. He'd been in this place before. The math was always the same. You triaged. You prioritized. You kept your hands doing one thing while your mind tracked another, and you did not under any circumstances allow yourself the luxury of fear until everyone who needed saving had been saved. Tell me about Tommy, he said, setting up the delivery supplies with practice movements. Clean towels stacked and ready, bulb syringe, cord clamps. He had 2 in the kit, which he'd always thought was excessive, and now considered one of the better decisions of his life. Sterile gloves. Not about what he does, about who he is. The question surprised her enough to cut through a contraction that was building. Why? Because in about 20 minutes, you're going to be in too much pain for conversation. And right now, talking is keeping your breathing regulated. So talk. He looked up at her. Tell me about your husband. She was quiet for a second, working through the contraction, and then, he's not what people think. That's what everyone says about the person they love. No, I mean, she exhaled slowly. He grew up into the system, foster care. The chapter was the first real family he ever had. He'd do anything for those people, anything. A pause, including things I can't always defend. But you love him anyway. I love him because I know what's underneath all of it. Most people never get to see that. Her voice had gone somewhere private and warm in spite of everything. He held my hand for 6 hours when I was in the hospital last year. Didn't move, didn't complain, didn't make it about him. A sharp breath as another contraction rolled through. That's the man I married. Does he know you're in labor? He doesn't even know I was attacked yet. We were supposed to be home 2 hours ago. By now he's... Her voice tightened, and this time it wasn't the contraction. By now he knows something's wrong. Silas thought about that. A man like Tommy Callahan, who'd built his entire adult life around protecting the people who were his, sitting somewhere right now knowing something had happened to his pregnant wife and having no information, no location, no answer. That was a specific kind of agony that Silas understood in his bones, and it made Tommy Callahan suddenly more three-dimensional than the name had been 60 seconds ago. He'll find you, Silas said. It wasn't reassurance, it was assessment. I know, she said. That's what worries me. Before he could respond to that, Barnaby stood up. The dog had been lying beside the couch for the last 20 minutes, calm and steady, in the way that old animals got calm, not because they were unaware, but because they'd lived long enough to choose their reactions. But now he was on his feet, all 3 of them, his body oriented toward the door, his ears forward in a sound building in his chest that was barely audible but unmistakable. Silas picked up the 12 gauge. How far? Chloe said. Close. He moved to the side of the window, back to the wall, the old position, and looked out from the edge of the curtain. The first SUV had stopped maybe 80 yards from the cabin. The engine was still running. No one had gotten out yet. The second vehicle pulled up behind the first and stopped the same way. They're not rushing, he said, thinking out loud. They're watching. They do that. They like to know what they're walking into. Her voice had gone flat and knowledgeable. The voice of a woman who understood the business of threat assessment because she'd lived inside it for years. They'll wait for a signal. They'll look for movement. Then we don't move. He came back to her, set the shotgun within reach, and knelt beside her. Contraction, coming. Breathe through it. Don't tense your shoulders. Down through your belly. He coached her through it the way he'd coached hundreds of women through hundreds of deliveries, his hand on her forearm, his voice a metronome. She wrote it well, better than well, actually. She wrote it like someone who had decided pain was a negotiation and she was going to win. When it passed, she said 6 minutes. 6 minutes apart now. Yes. She looked at him with a calm that was almost unnerving. We're moving fast. You're moving fast. The baby's moving fast. He checked her blood pressure again. Slightly better, the IV was doing its job. I need to examine you. I need to know how far along you are. Is that okay? Do what you need to do. He did. It was quick, clinical, and delivered information he needed. She was at 7 centimeters. 3 more to go before pushing, and given the pace things were moving, he gave it 40 minutes. Maybe less. 40 minutes during which at least 2 SUVs full of cartel soldiers were sitting 80 yards away in the dark. He stood up and went back to the window. They hadn't moved. Why haven't they come to the door? He said, not really directing it at her. Because they're not sure whose cabin this is. She understood them, Silas realized. She understood how they thought, how they operated, and that knowledge was as much a survival tool as anything in his medical kit. They saw me come in here, but they don't know if you're alone. They don't know your firepower. They're waiting to see if a light comes on, if someone comes out. They're patient. How patient? Until they're sure. A beat. Or until someone gives the order. Silas set the shotgun on the kitchen table barrel toward the door position so that he could reach it from his working position by the couch without crossing in front of any window. Then he went back to Chloe and took her hand. I want you to hear me, he said. Both of us, you and the baby, are getting through tonight. I don't care what's outside that door. Inside this cabin right here, the only thing that exists is getting your son into the world safely. Everything else is noise. She looked at him for a long moment. You really believe that? I've delivered babies under mortar fire, he said. I know what noise is. Something shifted in her eyes, the last of the doubt maybe, or the last of the reserve. Okay. She squeezed his hand. Okay, Silas, let's do this. The next hour was the most concentrated piece of living Silas had done in 11 years. The contractions came down to 5 minutes, then 4. He managed her position, adjusted her breathing, monitored her blood pressure every 15 minutes, talked her through each wave with the specific, unhurried competence of a man who understood that calm was contagious, that if he stayed steady, her body would take that signal and work with it instead of against it. Between contractions, they talked. She told him about growing up in Phoenix, about meeting Tommy at 23, about being terrified of his world and more terrified of a life without him in it. She told him about the pregnancy, how Tommy had actually cried, when she told him sitting in their kitchen at 7 in the morning, with his coffee going cold, this big hard man with his knuckles and his patches and his history weeping quietly because something good was finally happening to him. Silas told her about Vietnam, about the field hospital in the Delta, where he delivered his first baby in the back of a supply truck with no anesthesia and a flashlight held by a 19-year-old private who kept saying he thought he was going to faint. He told her about Phoenix General, about the cases that never left him, about the ones that did. He didn't tell her what he'd seen outside the window at the 40-minute mark. He'd gone to check casual, unhurried in appearance while she was deep in a contraction and not tracking him. And what he'd seen was the first SUV's door opening. One man getting out, standing beside the vehicle, looking at the cabin, not moving yet, but measuring the distance the way a man measured a distance before he crossed it. Silas had gone back to Chloe without changing his expression. Now at the 50-minute mark, with Chloe at 9 centimeters and the baby's arrival minutes away, he could see from the edge of his peripheral awareness, never leaving her face, never letting her see him look, that a second door had opened. 2 men outside now, still not moving toward the cabin. But the patience was wearing thinner. Silas. Her voice had changed, had gone lower and more animal, the voice that came when the body fully took over from the mind. It's time. I know. He was already gloved, already positioned. The towels were ready, the clamps were ready, everything was where it needed to be. Chloe, I need you to listen to my voice and nothing else. Not the storm, Not whatever's outside, just my voice. Can you do that? Yes, it came out through clenched teeth. Good. Now, when the next contraction peaks, I need you to push. Outside, without Silas seeing it, a third door opened. Three men now standing in the dark, waiting, deciding. And inside the cabin, a woman who had been shot and chased through a mountain storm held the hand of a 72-year-old retired medic she'd known for less than 2 hours and pushed with everything she had left. That's it, Silas said. That's exactly it. Don't stop. Keep going. Barnaby sat down beside them very still, as if even the dog understood that this was the moment, the exact fulcrum of the night, the point on which everything balanced. New life in one direction, the armed dark in the other. Silas kept his eyes on what mattered. Outside, the first man took a step toward the cabin, and then his radio crackled, and he stopped. The radio crackled once, and the man outside stopped walking. Silas didn't know that. He was entirely focused on Chloe, on the specific and sacred emergency happening right in front of him. His gloved hands steady, his voice low and constant. The whole world reduced to this couch, this woman, this child who had decided that tonight, storm and blood and armed men and all, was the night he was coming into the world. Again, Silas said, same push, same breath. Don't let go of it. Chloe's face was something beyond pain now. She'd moved through pain 20 minutes ago and come out the other side into pure determination, the kind that didn't have words attached to it, just the raw biological will of a body doing the most fundamental thing a body could do. Her teeth were locked. Her hands had found the edge of the couch cushion, and she'd torn into it with both fists, and she pushed the way people pushed when they had something to live for that was bigger than what was happening to their body. I can see him, Silas said, and his voice for the first time all night had something in it that wasn't clinical. Something that crept in past the training and the decades and the carefully maintained professional distance. Something that might have been wonder. Chloe, he's right there. One more. I can't. You can. You've been doing the impossible for the last 3 hours. One more push. She made a sound that the storm outside didn't cover, a sound that was rage and effort and love all stripped down to their essential noise, and she pushed. And James Callahan came into the world at 2:14 in the morning in a cabin in the mountains of northern Arizona, delivered by a 72-year-old retired combat medic named Silas Pendleton, while a storm raged outside and 3 men with guns stood 80 yards away in the dark. He was small, he was early, he was furious about it. The cry that came out of him was not the tentative sound of an uncertain arrival. It was a declaration, high and clear and absolutely unmistakably alive, and it cut right through the noise of the storm and the weight of the night and hit Silas somewhere under his sternum that he'd thought had been sealed off for years. Chloe made a sound that was the opposite of the one she'd made during the push. Soft, broken open in the best possible way. He's perfect. Silas was already working, clearing the airway, checking color, his hands doing 30 years of automatic work while his eyes cataloged everything he needed to know. Good color, strong cry, moving all 4 limbs. He is absolutely perfect, Chloe. She was crying. She probably didn't know she was crying. The tears were just happening, like breathing, like the cry of her son, automatic, unstoppable. The body's honest response to something too large for it to contain any other way. Silas clamped and cut the cord with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds were still critical. He wrapped the baby in a clean towel, checking warmth, checking responsiveness, then placed him on Chloe's chest with the care of someone handling the most valuable thing they'd ever touched. James Callahan stopped crying the instant he felt his mother's heartbeat. Silas sat back on his heels and allowed himself exactly 5 seconds. 5 seconds to feel what had just happened, to let it land, to acknowledge that something extraordinary had just occurred in this small space. An old man alone in the mountains thought finished with the world, and the world had knocked on his door and refused to let him be finished. Then he stood up and went to the window. The 3 men outside hadn't moved toward the cabin. The radio had stopped them, and they were still standing in the same positions, but something had changed in their posture. They were no longer measuring the distance to the door. They were looking up the road. Silas heard it before he saw it, a sound underneath the storm, a vibration that wasn't thunder, wasn't wind, wasn't rain against the roof. Something rhythmic, something mechanical, something that started at the edge of hearing and grew the way a wave grew slowly, and then suddenly, and then overwhelming. He knew that sound. Everyone who'd ever lived in Arizona knew that sound. Motorcycles, not one, not 10. The number of motorcycles that made a sound like that was a number that changed the meaning of the word arrival. Chloe, he came back to her. She was still holding the baby, still in that private world of first contact, but she looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face brought her back. Does Tommy have a way of tracking your location? Anything on your person, a phone, jewelry, anything? Her expression shifted. Her free hand went to her wrist, where a bracelet sat, simple leather, the kind that could have been anything. He put a tracker in this 2 years ago. He told me I'd probably never need it. She looked at it. He told me if I ever did need it, he'd come. He came, Silas said. The sound outside had become enormous. The 3 men from the SUVs were back in their vehicles. Not because they'd given up, Silas could feel that from across 80 yards, but because something had recalculated the situation, and the recalculation had not come out in their favor. Headlights, multiple sets sweeping across the mountain. Engines, the specific deep thunder of American V-twins in number coming up the mountain road from 2 directions, simultaneously moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had done this kind of thing before and knew exactly how to do it. Chloe heard it. She pulled the baby closer and looked at the door. That's him. Yes. He's going to come in here ready to kill someone. Yes. And you're going to be standing here with blood on your hands and my husband's son on the couch. Silas looked down at his gloves. She had a point. He stripped them off and went to the sink and washed his hands with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who understood that first impressions sometimes happened in the middle of life or death situations and still mattered anyway. What do I do? Chloe said. He's going to be out of his mind. He's going to be a father, Silas said. Let's let that be the first thing he is when he walks through that door. Outside, the world reorganized itself in the space of 90 seconds. The sound of the motorcycle stopped. All at once, in the disciplined way of men who moved as one organism, the engines cut, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the storm. Silas heard voices, not words, just the register of men communicating quickly, efficiently, establishing positions, and he had enough military experience to recognize the acoustic footprint of a coordinated deployment even when he couldn't see it. Then boots on the porch, heavy, one person, moving fast. The door opened without a knock. Tommy Callahan was 44 years old and built like someone who had never once allowed the world to make him small. He filled the doorway the way certain men fill doorways, not by width alone, but by the total mass of their presence, the accumulated weight of who they were and what they'd done and what they were capable of. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples. His beard was full. His vest bore the patches of a man who had earned everything on it, and his eyes, when they swept the cabin in the first half second, assessed the room, assessed Silas, assessed the blood. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already decided to destroy whatever needed destroying and was still deciding what qualified. He saw Silas first. His hand went to the .44 Magnum on his hip before his brain finished processing pure reflex, the instinct of a man who had survived by reacting faster than he thought. "Who are you?" Tommy said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man giving someone one chance. "I'm the person who just saved your wife and son." Silas stood very still. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He had learned a long time ago that backing away from a certain kind of man communicated exactly the wrong thing. "My name is Silas Pendleton. I'm a retired combat medic and trauma nurse. Chloe knocked on my door about 3 hours ago. She'd been shot and she was in labor. She is no longer in danger of dying. Your son is healthy and breathing and on that couch right now." Tommy's eyes moved past him, and the gun went back in the holster. He crossed the room in 4 steps and dropped to his knees in front of the couch. And what happened to his face in that moment was not something Silas looked at directly. It was private. It was the kind of private that a man like Tommy Callahan probably hadn't allowed himself in years, maybe decades. And Silas turned away from it and went to the kitchen sink and looked at the wall and gave him 30 seconds. He heard Chloe say his name, heard the crack in her voice and the answering sound from Tommy that was somewhere between a word and something that didn't have a word yet. "Hey," Tommy said very low to the baby. Just that. "Hey," like an introduction. Silas stayed at the kitchen wall for another few seconds. Then he heard boots behind him. Pendleton. He turned. Tommy was standing at the kitchen doorway, the baby still in the crook of one arm, Chloe's hand in his other, and his face had reorganized itself back into something guarded and assessing. But the gun was still holstered, and his body language had changed subtly structurally. The violence had stepped back one row. My guy outside says the cartel SUVs are about a quarter mile down the mountain. Stopped. Tommy's jaw was tight. They were inside your radius. Yes. You kept them back. I positioned myself so that if they came through the door, it would have been expensive for them. Silas said it the way he said everything, flat factual, no drama attached. They waited to assess. The assessment took long enough that your people arrived first. Tommy looked at him, really looked at him the way men who were good judges of character look not just at the face but at the whole posture, the whole history written in someone's body. You were Army, combat medic, 2 tours, then 30 years trauma nursing. And you just happened to be on this mountain. I live here. I've lived here for 11 years. Silas met his gaze steadily. I wasn't looking for trouble, Mr. Callahan. Trouble knocked on my door. Something moved through Tommy's expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibration. She told you who I am. She did. And you still, he stopped, looked down at the baby in his arm, at this small, furious, perfect new person, and back up at Silas. You still opened the door. I was a medic for 40 years, Silas said for the second time that night. There was never going to be a version of this where I didn't open the door. The silence between them had weight, the kind of weight that came when 2 people from completely different worlds recognized something in each other that neither had expected to find. I need to look at Chloe's wound, Silas said, because the clinical necessity was real regardless of the emotional atmosphere. The packing I did was field work. She needs surgical follow-up within the next few hours. The bleeding has slowed, but that's not a permanent fix. Tommy nodded once. Sharp! The nod of a man who understood logistics and moved on them. I've got a doctor, private. He's 20 minutes out. Good, make it 15. Tommy almost smiled. Almost. Come with me. He turned and went back to Chloe, handed her the baby with a tenderness so at odds with everything else about him that it was briefly disorienting, and leaned down and said something in her ear that Silas didn't hear. She nodded and pressed her forehead against his for a moment. Then Tommy straightened and walked to the front door and opened it. Outside in the dark, Silas could feel them without seeing them clearly. The specific stillness of a large group of men who were holding themselves in disciplined readiness, waiting on the word of the man at the door. They were everywhere, in the tree line, on the road, at positions that Silas, looking out from the side, could map by instinct. The training never really left, and it told him that the perimeter Tommy's people had established was thorough and professional in a way that most civilians would never expect from a motorcycle club. Stand down, Tommy said, his voice carried without effort. He's clear. The atmosphere changed. The readiness didn't disappear, but it reshaped itself. From threat posture into something else, watchful still, but no longer pointed inward. Silas exhaled something he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Tommy came back inside and stood at the kitchen table. The men in the SUVs aren't cartel rank and file, he said. His voice had gone quieter now, operational. They're hired contractors. Someone paid for this job specifically. Someone who knew Chloe's route, her timing, the vehicle. An inside source, Silas said. That's what I'm thinking. Tommy looked at him directly. You understand what that means? It means the threat isn't over. It means the threat is closer than cartel. Tommy's jaw set. Someone in my world did this. That hit the room differently than the sound of the motorcycles had. The motorcycles had been an external force, enormous and clarifying. This was the interior damage, the specific, quiet devastation of betrayal, which was always worse than any enemy, because it came from the direction you hadn't been watching. I'm sorry, Silas said, and meant it simply. Tommy looked at him. The guard came down by 1 increment. You don't have to be sorry about anything. He stopped, ran a hand across his beard. You don't know what you did tonight. You can't. I delivered a baby, Silas said. I've done it before. That's my son. Tommy's voice was very quiet. That boy in there, I wasn't supposed to get things like that. I made peace with not getting things like that a long time ago. He looked at the floor for a moment, and in that moment, Silas saw the boy underneath everything. The kid from the system, the one who'd grown armor because he'd needed it to survive wearing it so long he had almost forgotten it was armor and not skin. You gave me back something I didn't know I was about to lose. Silas didn't say anything. Some things didn't need commentary. From the couch, Chloe's voice came through. Tommy, come hold your son while Silas checks my side. Both men moved at once, Tommy back to the couch, Silas to the medical kit, the room reorganizing itself around this new reality. A man who'd come up the mountain ready to burn it down now, sitting with his child against his chest. A retired medic who'd spent 11 years trying to be done with emergencies, checking his work with steady hands. Barnaby settled at Tommy's feet like he'd known the man for years. Tommy looked down at the palm with an expression caught between surprise and something warmer. 3 legs. Car accident, Silas said, checking the wound packing. 3 years ago, he didn't slow down. Tommy looked at Silas, then back at Barnaby. Something in his face had a particular quality that Silas had seen before, the look of a person absorbing a small story about resilience and feeling it somewhere they didn't expect. Chloe. Silas kept his voice steady as he worked. The packing held. The bleeding is minimal. I want you off that wound and lying on your right side until the doctor gets here. I'm fine, she said. You've been shot, he said. Fine is not in your current repertoire. She laughed, actually laughed short and real, and the sound of it in the cabin after everything that had happened in the last 3 hours was so unexpected that Tommy looked up from the baby, and Silas allowed himself something that was technically a smile. The radio on Tommy's vest crackled. One of his men outside, the voice tight, the SUVs are moving, heading back down the mountain. Tommy's expression didn't change. Let them run, we'll find them. Copy that. A pause. Another crackle behind Kisham. Boss, you need to know something. Is the tracking on the vehicles, we ran the plates. The lead SUV is registered to a holding company. The voice hesitated. 1 second, 2. The holding company has Marco Reyes as a signatory. The name landed like a grenade with a 3-second fuse. Tommy went absolutely still. In Silas's peripheral vision, the man's entire body changed, not tensing, but crystallizing, hardening around a specific point of information, the way water hardened around a foreign body when it froze. You sure? Tommy said into the radio. Ran it twice. He clicked off, looked at nothing for a moment. Then Marco Reyes has been my sergeant-at-arms for 6 years. Chloe went white. Tommy, he was at the table 3 days ago. Tommy's voice was very controlled now, in the way that extreme anger sometimes produced extraordinary control. He knew about your trip. He knew the route. He knew the vehicle. He looked at his son, at this small, sleeping face, and something terrible and cold moved behind his eyes. He knew everything. Silas stepped back from the medical kit. He was quiet for a moment, letting the information settle, understanding his own position in this story clearly. He was a civilian. This was not his world. The mechanics of what was about to happen next, the accounting that Tommy Callahan was going to perform on Marco Reyes, were not something he was part of and not something he was going to ask about. But he was also standing in the room where Tommy Callahan had just become a father, and that made him something. Witness, maybe, or anchor. Your doctor, Silas said. Is he actually 15 minutes out? Tommy blinked, came back to the room. Yes. Then that's what we focus on right now. Silas pulled a chair to the couch and sat down, meeting Tommy's eyes directly over the heads of his wife and son. Everything else can wait 30 minutes. Right now in this cabin, the only thing that matters is that your family is safe. Tommy held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked down at the baby in his arms, at this impossibly small new person who had arrived in the hardest possible way and survived it, and his grip tightened. Not roughly, but with the specific care of a man who was understanding, for the first time, what it meant to be responsible for something that could break. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, okay. Outside, the night had passed its worst point. The storm was still going, but its pitch had changed, less fury, more exhaustion, the way storms ended when they'd said everything they needed to say. Silas looked at Chloe. She was watching her husband hold her son with an expression that had no name. He knew all the fear and pain, an impossible night folded under something enormous and simple and true. She looked at Silas over Tommy's shoulder. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. The way he always nodded when thanks arrived after the work was done, accepting it without diminishing it because it cost people something to say and cost him nothing to receive. Barnaby put his head on Silas's knee. The radio crackled again. A voice outside said the doctor's headlights were visible on the road. And in the cabin on the mountain in the last dark hour before dawn, the night held still. The doctor's name was Reeves, and he arrived the way people arrived when Tommy Callahan summoned them fast. No questions, carrying everything he needed and leaving everything he didn't behind. He was 50-something, compact, with the specific manner of a man who had worked in circumstances that didn't allow for the usual professional formalities. He shook Silas's hand at the door, took one look at the wound at the IV setup at the packing work, and said, "Who did this?" "I did," Silas said. Reeves looked at him differently after that, not with surprise exactly, but with the quiet professional respect of one practitioner, recognizing another's competence in the field. 30 years trauma, 32 counting the Army. Then you already know what I'm going to tell you. I know what I'm hoping you're going to tell me. Reeves crouched beside Chloe and began his assessment, and Silas stepped back and let him work, because that was the other thing. 40 years in medicine gave you the ability to hand off without ego, to recognize when your part was done and someone else's part had begun. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, not because he wanted it, but because his hands needed something to do. Tommy followed him. He stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching Silas fill the pot with the particular stillness of a large man containing a large amount of emotion through sheer force of will. The baby was back with Chloe while the doctor worked. Tommy had surrendered him reluctantly, the way new fathers surrendered their children to anyone, even doctors. And without the child in his arms, he seemed slightly less anchored, the fury about Marco Reyes sitting closer to the surface. "Tell me what you need," Tommy said. Silas looked up from the coffee. "I don't need anything." "That's not what I said." Tommy's voice was even. "I said, tell me what you need. That's a different question." Silas looked at him for a moment. "You mean as compensation?" "I mean as acknowledgement." Tommy moved to the table and sat down, which was somehow a more significant gesture than it appeared a man who held a very specific kind of authority, choosing to sit at another man's table and make himself level with him. "You saved my wife. You saved my son. You held back 3 armed professionals with a shotgun and a .45 while you were simultaneously delivering a baby." A pause. "There is no number I can put on that, so I'm not going to try. I'm going to ask what you need, and I'm going to provide it." Silas poured the water and set the pot, turned around and leaned against the counter, looking at Tommy Callahan sitting at his kitchen table at 3:30 in the morning, looking back at him with those dark, serious eyes that had seen far too much and were still underneath all of it, the eyes of a man who had a code. "I need Chloe to get to a proper surgical facility," Silas said. "Tonight, before dawn. Already arranged. Phoenix, best surgical team in the state. They're waiting. I need to know the baby's going to be monitored. He's 3 weeks early, and his temperature regulation isn't. Reeves will manage it. He's got a full NICU set up at the facility. And I need..." Silas stopped. Tommy waited. "I need to know this is over," Silas said. "Not the cartel problem. I understand that's not resolved in a single night, but I need to know that whatever comes next, it doesn't come back here, to this cabin, to this life." He said it without apology, without softness. "I chose this mountain because I was done with violence. I am still done with violence. I helped your family because it was right, not because I want a place in your world." Tommy held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single, slow, fully committed nod. "You have my word." "I don't know what your word is worth," Silas said. It wasn't confrontational, it was honest. "No," Tommy said, "you don't." He sat forward, elbows on the table. "So let me tell you, in 20 years I've given my word to 4 people outside the chapter. All 4 of them are still standing. All 4 of them have never had a reason to test it." He met Silas's eyes without blinking. "You'll be the 5th. From the living room, Reeves's voice carried through. "Mr. Pendleton, come look at this." Both men went. Reeves was standing, his assessment complete. His expression carrying the specific combination of professional satisfaction and residual concern that Silas recognized immediately. Wound is clean. Packing was textbook. The hemostatic gauze saved her significant blood loss another 45 minutes without it, and we'd be having a very different conversation. He looked at Silas directly. "You bought her the time she needed." Chloe was watching Silas from the couch. She'd heard every word. "The baby?" Silas asked. "Strong, considering." Reeves bounced slightly on his heels, a habit Silas recognized as the physical tick of a physician who was genuinely pleased. "Lungs are clear. Heart rate is excellent. He's small, but he's fighting. 3 weeks early is manageable with proper monitoring." He paused. "You check the airway immediately." "Of course." A lot of people don't in field deliveries. They get focused on the mother and forget the first 60 seconds are everything for the baby. Reeves closed his bag. "You didn't forget." Tommy had been standing behind Silas during this exchange, and when it ended, he put one hand on Silas's shoulder just briefly, just once, the kind of contact that men like Tommy Callahan rationed carefully because it meant something when they gave it. Then he removed his hand and went to Chloe. "We need to move in the next 30 minutes, Tommy told her. "Can you travel?" "I've been traveling for the last 4 hours, she said. "I've been shot. I've given birth. I think I can manage a car ride." "That's my wife," Tommy said to no one in particular, with an expression that was approximately 40% exasperation and 60% the kind of love that had no good language for itself. The next 30 minutes moved fast. Tommy's men, some of whom had come inside now, filling the cabin with a quiet, watchful presence that Silas absorbed without reaction, began preparing for transport. They were efficient, these men. Whatever their world looked like from the outside, inside the work they were organized and purposeful, and they listened to Tommy's instructions without repetition needed. Silas stood to one side and let it happen. He'd done his part. This was the handoff. He was good at handoffs. But then one of the men, a big red-headed one named Birch, who had the shoulders of someone who'd been loading heavy things since childhood, stopped beside Silas and said quietly, "You ex-military, Army, combat medic." Birch nodded the nod of one veteran recognizing another. "My father was a medic. Korea." He was quiet for a second. He said the medic was always the one who went toward the thing everyone else was running from. Silas didn't say anything. "That's what you did tonight," Birch said. "You went toward it." He looked at Silas with a directness that wasn't aggressive, just honest, the kind of honesty that came from men who'd been in enough situations where honesty was the only currency that mattered. "We don't forget that. None of us will forget that." He moved on before Silas could respond, which was fine. Silas didn't have a response ready anyway. Tommy appeared at his elbow. "We've got a situation developing." Silas looked at him. "Marco Reyes. One of my men located him 40 minutes ago. He's at a truck stop off I-17 south of Flagstaff." Tommy's jaw was set. He was waiting for confirmation that the job was done. The implication of that settled over the room like weather. Waiting for confirmation that Chloe was dead, that the baby was dead, that the man who had sat at Tommy's table, carried his trust, worn the patch that his arrangement with whoever had paid for this had been completed. "He doesn't know it went wrong yet," Silas said. "The contractors haven't checked in, which means he's been sitting at that truck stop for 4 hours wondering what happened." Tommy looked at nothing for a moment. "I want to go get him myself." "Someone needs to stay with Chloe," Silas said. Not a suggestion, a statement of medical reality. Tommy turned to look at him. "She cannot be moved without someone who knows what to watch for," Silas continued. "Her blood pressure dropped twice tonight. If it drops again during transport and no one knows the signs," he stopped. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what she needs." A beat of silence. Tommy turned to Birch. "You're riding with them to Phoenix. You don't leave that facility until I arrive." Then he turned back to Silas. "Will you go with her?" Silas looked at Chloe. She was watching him with those green eyes that had been frightened and brave and exhausted and fierce all in the same night, and right now they were asking the question that Tommy had just asked out loud. "Yes," Silas said. Chloe reached out and took his hand. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. They moved Chloe to the transport vehicle, a large SUV, not black, dark blue, with a reclined rear seat that Reeves had configured as a makeshift transport gurney, with the combined efficiency of the doctor, 2 of Tommy's men, and Silas, who monitored her blood pressure continuously from the moment she stood up to the moment she was horizontal again. Barnaby watched from the porch confused, and Silas paused on his way to the vehicle and crouched down and held the dog's face in both hands. "I'll be back," he said. "Don't eat anything stupid while I'm gone." Barnaby licked his ear. One of Tommy's younger men was standing nearby, and witnessed this, and his expression was caught between amusement and something unexpectedly soft. He reached down and scratched Barnaby behind the ears without being asked. "I'll stay with him," he said. "I've got nowhere else to be." Silas looked at the kid, 22, maybe 23, with a scar on his chin and eyes that had been old longer than the rest of his face. "What's your name, Danny?" "Danny, he eats twice a day. He's had his medications for today already. Don't let him convince you otherwise. He's a liar about food." Danny almost smiled. "Yes, sir." Silas got in the vehicle. The convoy moved down the mountain as dawn began its approach at the edges of the sky, not visible yet, but present in the way that dawn was always present just before it arrived, a lightening of the dark rather than an arrival of light. Tommy's people surrounded the transport on all sides, front and rear, a moving perimeter that left nothing to chance. Silas sat in the back beside Chloe, checking her vitals at regular intervals, his kit open on the seat between them. The baby was in a carry setup that Reeves had arranged secured and warm, and Chloe had one hand on him at all times, the contact both comfort and monitoring a mother's instinctive need to confirm presence. "He's going to be okay," Silas said at one point, not to reassure her, because the vitals genuinely said so. "I know," she said. "I knew it when you put him on my chest. Some things you just know." They were quiet for a while. The road straightened as they came off the mountain and the convoy picked up speed. "Can I ask you something?" Chloe said. "Yes." "Did you ever have a family of your own?" The question landed gently the way she'd meant it to. "A wife," Silas said. "Ruth, she died 8 years ago. Cancer." He looked out the window. "We didn't have children. We tried for a long time. Then we stopped trying and just had each other, which turned out to be enough. I'm sorry about Ruth." "So am I, every day." He said it without performance, just the straight, clean fact of grief after enough years that it had stopped being an open wound and become simply part of the architecture of who he was. "She would have liked you." Chloe was quiet for a moment. "What was she like? Stubborn, funny, could see through a lie at 100 yards and had no patience for self-pity." He paused. "She was a trauma nurse too. That's where we met." "Of course she was. She would have had opinions about your wound packing," he said. "She always had opinions about wound packing." Chloe laughed, and the laugh turned into something that caught in her throat, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. "I think tonight just caught up with me," she said. "That's normal," Silas said. "The body holds on until it doesn't have to anymore. You're safe now, so it's letting go." She cried quietly for a few minutes. He let her. He didn't pat her hand or tell her it was okay, or do any of the reflexive comfort gestures that people did when they were uncomfortable with another person's emotion. He just sat with her, present and steady, the way he'd learned that real comfort actually worked, not by filling the space, but by not abandoning it. When she was done, she wiped her face and looked at the baby. "James Silas Callahan," she said. He looked at her. "We were going to name him James, after Tommy's grandfather, the only person in his family who was ever kind to him." She turned to look at Silas directly. "But James needs a middle name, and I think he should be named it after the man who brought him into the world." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to." "James Silas," he said quietly. He said it the way you said something you were going to want to remember exactly. "That's a good name." "It's a great name," she said, and she meant it the way people meant things when they'd been through enough in a single night to compress a lifetime of trust into a few hours. They reached Phoenix as the sun came fully up. Real dawn now. Not the suggestion of it, but the actual thing, the sky going from gray to pale gold to the specific clear blue of an Arizona morning that had followed a hard night. The facility was private, clean, exactly what Reeves had described, with a team waiting at the entrance as the convoy pulled in. Silas stayed with Chloe until the surgical team had her assessed and stabilized, and she was genuinely, medically, verifiably out of the woods. He stood at the edge of her room while doctors and nurses moved around her with the organized efficiency of people who were very good at their jobs, and he watched them work the way a man watched work he'd once done himself, with recognition and a quiet, settled peace. At some point, Tommy appeared in the doorway beside him. "Marco Reyes," Silas said without looking at him. "Handled," Tommy said. The word had no inflection. It was a closing word, a word that meant the accounting had been done and the subject was finished. Silas didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. The cartel connection, he said instead. Working on it. Tommy watched his wife through the window of the hospital room. This woman who had been shot and survived and delivered his son in a stranger's cabin in a mountain storm. There were three other names. The contractors gave them up. His voice was very controlled. None of them expected to be found. They never do, Silas said. No. Tommy turned to look at him. You should know something. What you did tonight, what you did for my family, that's not something that gets said thank you to and then walked away from. In my world, when someone does something like that, it means something permanent. I told you I don't want a place in your world. I heard you. Tommy held his gaze. I'm not offering you a place in my world. I'm telling you that my world is now permanently aware of yours. He let that settle. You live on that mountain alone. You've lived there for 11 years without anyone watching your back. That changes today. Not because I'm imposing something on you, because it's what's right. A pause. You ever need anything at all? A phone call solves it. Silas looked at him for a long moment. I'm a private person, Tommy. So am I. The corner of Tommy's mouth moved. Doesn't mean I'd let someone I owed go unprotected. From inside the room, Chloe's voice came through, directed at the nurse nearest her. Can someone tell my husband to stop hovering in the hallway and come hold his son? Tommy went. Silas stayed in the hallway, sat down in a chair against the wall, and folded his hands in his lap and let the exhaustion arrive, the full weight of the night, all the hours of it landing on him at once, now that the work was done. He was 72 years old, and he'd delivered a baby and held armed men at bay and talked a grieving, furious man down from the edge and driven 2 hours to Phoenix, and he was genuinely and comprehensively tired. But underneath the tired something else, something quieter, older, the specific feeling of a life that had briefly remembered what it was made for. Birch appeared from down the corridor, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to Sasanaman without ceremony, then sat down in the chair beside him. They sat together in the hallway, 2 men with shared exhaustion and shared history of a sort, drinking bad hospital coffee in the early morning light. Danny called, Birch said. The dog's fine, ate his breakfast, went back to sleep. Of course he did, Silas said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Down the hall, through the window, Silas could see Tommy Callahan sitting on the edge of his wife's hospital bed, with his son in his arms, talking to Chloe, in a low voice, the total picture of a man who had almost lost everything and hadn't, sitting in the aftermath of that near loss with the careful reverence of someone who understood exactly what they'd been spared. Birch followed Silas's gaze. He's different, he said quietly. Since last night, something in him, he stopped searching for words that weren't quite available. He's been carrying something for a long time, waiting for something to go permanently wrong. You don't grow up the way he grew up without expecting the good things to eventually get taken. He paused. Last night should have been the worst night of his life. It wasn't, Silas said. No. Birch drank his coffee. It wasn't. A nurse came down the corridor and smiled at Silas. Are you the one who delivered the baby? Yes. She looked at him with the kind of professional admiration that didn't need elaboration. The baby's vitals are excellent. The attending said to tell you whoever did the initial airway clearance did it perfectly. Silas nodded. When she was gone, Birch looked at him sideways. You're not going to celebrate that at all, are you? It was the right thing to do, Silas said. Doing the right thing isn't something to celebrate. It's just something to do. Birch was quiet for a moment. My father used to say something like that. Smart man. He was. Birch finished his coffee. He also said the best medics were the ones who never stopped believing every life was worth saving, even when the math said otherwise. He looked at Silas. You still believe that? Silas thought about the storm, about the door, about the weight of a woman falling into his arms and the cry of a child cutting through the worst night in a long time. Yeah, he said, I still believe that. Outside, the morning was fully arrived, bright and washed clean by the night's storm. The sky, the kind of blue that came after hard weather, deeper than ordinary blue, more deliberate, the color of something that had been through something and come out the other side, still itself. Silas finished his coffee and closed his eyes for 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, he thought about Ruth the way he always thought about Ruth when something had happened that she would have wanted to hear about. He could almost hear her voice, dry and warm and precise. 61 babies, Silas. You couldn't make it 60. He almost smiled. Down the hall, James Silas Callahan made a sound that was approximately the smallest version of a declaration Silas had ever heard. Small fists, clear lungs, an entire life assembled and ready, starting here, starting now in the particular improbable morning that followed the most improbable night. The debt between them, all of them, Silas and Tommy, and Chloe and this new child had no name yet. But it had weight, and it had permanence. And in Tommy Callahan's world, those two things together meant something that didn't end when the morning did. Silas drove back to the mountain alone. Tommy had offered a driver, a car, and escort, all three simultaneously in the particular way that Tommy Callahan made offers, which was less like offering and more like quietly insisting until the other person understood that declining wasn't really available. Silas had declined anyway. He'd borrowed a set of keys from one of Tommy's men for a plain gray truck that had been sitting in the facility parking lot, promised to have it back within 48 hours, and driven north out of Phoenix as the morning rush was just beginning to build, and the city waking up around him without any idea what had happened in the mountains while it slept. He needed the drive. He needed the 2 hours of road and sky and the particular silence of a man alone with something large that he was still sorting through. He'd delivered 61 babies in his life. He'd packed gunshot wounds in the backs of helicopters. He'd talked men down from the edge and held the hands of people who were leaving and been the last voice some of them ever heard. He was not by any measure a man who was easily unsettled by events. But something had happened on that mountain that didn't fit neatly into any category he had. It wasn't the emergency he'd handled worse. It wasn't the danger he'd faced worse. It was something about the specific combination of being found and being needed after 11 years of having chosen neither. Something about a door he'd opened without thinking, and what had walked through it, and what it had cost him, and what it had given back. Ruth would have known what to call it. She was always better with words for the interior things. He pulled up to the cabin as the morning was getting properly warm, that clean-washed Arizona warmth that followed storms and felt like the world had made an effort. He got out of the truck, and before he'd taken 3 steps, the cabin door opened, and Danny appeared on the porch, with Barnaby beside him, the dog moving as fast as 3 legs allowed his whole back end wagging in the specific full-body celebration that golden retrievers performed when someone they loved came home. Silas crouched down and took the full force of it, the cold nose against his face, the paws on his knees, the warm weight of the animal pressing into him with complete and uncomplicated joy. He held the dog for a moment longer than he needed to. "Good trip," Danny said from the porch. "Long trip," Silas said. He straightened up. "You sleep. Few hours, couch is comfortable." Danny looked at him with those old young eyes. "How's Mrs. Callahan?" "Out of surgery. She'll be in the facility for a week, maybe less. She's strong." He looked at the cabin, then back at Danny. "The baby is doing well." Danny nodded slowly. Something moved in his expression, something he clearly wasn't used to letting show a kind of feeling that had gotten through the usual barrier. "Good," he said. Yeah, good." "You can go," Silas said. "I will be fine." Danny looked at him. "Mr. Pendleton." He stopped, started again. "I've been with Tommy for 4 years. I've seen a lot of things. I've seen a lot of people in tight spots." He seemed to be choosing his next words with care. "What you did last night, most people couldn't have done that. The medical stuff, yeah, maybe. But sitting there with all that coming at you and staying..." He shook his head slightly. "That's something else." Silas looked at him for a moment. "How old are you, Danny?" 23. "You're 23 years old and you're doing this work." "Yes, sir." "Is it what you want?" The question clearly wasn't what Danny expected. He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Silas saw the kid underneath the patch and the scar and the careful self-possession, saw the 23-year-old who probably hadn't been asked what he wanted in a long time, maybe ever. "I don't know," Danny said finally. "It's what I'm good at." "Those are different things," Silas said. He wasn't lecturing. He was stating a fact the same way he'd stated medical facts to patients for 30 years, not to tell them what to do, just to make sure they had information. "You seem smart. You seem capable. Whatever you decide to do with that is your business." He paused. "I just think it's worth knowing the difference between what you're good at and what you want." Danny absorbed this in silence. "Then, did you always want to be a medic?" No, I was 20 years old and the army needed medics and I needed direction. Silas looked at nothing for a moment. But somewhere in the first year, I stopped doing it because I had to and started doing it because it was the only thing that made sense to me. Because keeping people alive is, he stopped finding the word. It's a privilege, even when it's terrible, even when it costs you. It's a privilege every single time. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the small bag he'd left by the door, came down the porch steps and stopped beside Silas. He put out his hand. Silas shook it, a real handshake, firm, mutual, the kind that said something was understood between two people. "I'll be back," Danny said. "Tommy's orders." "I know. But also," a pause, "I'd come back anyway." He walked to his motorcycle, kicked it to life, and headed down the mountain road. Silas stood on the porch with Barnaby and watched him go. The first week after that night was the strangest week of Silas's 11 years on the mountain, and they had been in their own quiet way 11 genuinely strange years. On the second day, a truck arrived carrying 3 months of groceries, not a delivery service. A man named Curtis, late 40s, built like a former linebacker, gone slightly soft around the middle, who carried every bag inside himself and stacked everything in the kitchen with the methodical care of someone following specific instructions. He didn't stay long and he didn't say much, but before he left, he pressed a card into Silas's hand with a phone number on it and said, "You call this number for anything, day or night. Tommy's orders." "I don't need groceries," Silas said. "No one said you did," Curtis said pleasantly, and got back in his truck and drove away. On the fourth day, 2 men appeared at the end of the road with tools and repaired the washout that had cut the mountain path in half during the storm. They worked for 6 hours without being asked, without asking anything in return, and when they were done, the road was better than it had been before the storm. On the sixth day, Tommy called. Silas had the satellite phone charged and sitting on the kitchen table because some part of him had known the call was coming, and when it rang, he picked it up before the second tone. "How's Chloe?" he said before Tommy could speak. A brief pause and then something that was almost a laugh. "She's threatening to check herself out early. The doctors are losing the argument." Another pause. "She's fine, Silas. She's really fine." "And the baby?" "Eating, growing, furious about the world in the specific way of someone who has opinions." Tommy's voice carried something warm and bewildered, the tone of a man still getting used to loving something this much. He's something else." "James Silas," Silas said quietly. "James Silas Callahan." Tommy let the name sit for a moment. "Chloe told me. I want you to know that wasn't just her decision. I'd have chosen it too." Silas didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a hawk was crossing the sky in long, unhurried arcs, riding the thermal the way hawks did on Arizona mornings, moving without effort and covering enormous ground. "You didn't call just to tell me that," Silas said. "No." Tommy's voice shifted slightly, less warm, more operational. The 3 cartel contractors gave up everything. Names, contacts, payment chain. The network that funded the hit goes back further than the cartel it runs through 2 shell companies, both of which are now being looked at by people who are very good at finding things. A pause. Marco Reyes's contact in the cartel is a man named Vicente Cruz. Cruz is the one who paid for the contract. He believed that eliminating my family line while I was temporarily isolated would create a power vacuum that he could fill. Past tense, Silas noted. "Vicente Cruz will not be filling any vacuums," Tommy said. The sentence was complete and had nothing attached to it. Silas looked at the hawk. "Is it finished?" "The immediate threat is finished. The larger network that takes time. But nothing is pointed at you, Silas. Nothing has ever been pointed at you. You were an unknown variable in a plan that didn't anticipate you existing." A beat. "Nobody's going to make that mistake twice. Because you'll make sure of it. Because the word is out." Tommy's voice was very level. "Every chapter in this state knows what you did, not the details, the fact. A man on a mountain helped my family when they had nothing left. That's the story. That's enough." Another pause. "You're not in my world, Silas. But my world is aware of you. That's a different thing. That's a permanent thing." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I told you I wanted my life back. And you've got it. You'll have it." He could hear Tommy choosing words carefully, which was not Silas suspected something Tommy Callahan did very often. But a man who does what you did, you don't get to be invisible anymore. Not to us. That's not a threat. It's just a pause. It's just how it is. Some things change things. Some things do, Silas said. I'm going to come see you, Tommy said. When Chloe's cleared and the baby is strong, maybe 2 weeks, 3. A pause. If that's okay. Silas looked at the cabin, at the repaired road, at the hawk still circling unhurried, at Barnaby sitting on the porch step with his face turned toward the sun, ancient and content and entirely at peace with the world as it was. It's okay, Silas said. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon when the October air had gone from post-storm clean to full autumn gold, Silas heard the motorcycles on the mountain road. He was on the porch with coffee and Barnaby and a book he hadn't been reading. He heard them the same way he'd heard them that night, the specific growing sound of a large number of engines moving with coordinated purpose. But this time there was no storm, and no darkness, and no armed men in the trees, and the sound didn't produce the cold tactical readiness it had produced before. This time it produced something he hadn't expected. Something that was almost not quite, but almost the feeling of people coming home. They came up the road in formation, not all 670, not this time, but 40 or 50 of them, more than enough to fill the clearing in front of the cabin, with the combined presence of people who had made a choice about where they were going and why. Tommy led them, and beside him on a second bike, moving carefully, clearly, still careful with herself, but upright and present and real, was Chloe. Silas stood up from his chair. Barnaby went immediately down the porch steps, tail already going, because Barnaby had decided 3 weeks ago that Tommy Callahan was fundamentally all right and saw no reason to revise this position. Tommy cut his engine and got off his bike and came up the path, and behind him Chloe was helped carefully off her bike by 2 of the men, and she came forward slowly, one arm, held by a woman named Rita, who was apparently the chapter's informal den mother and had opinions about everything, including wound care. In Tommy's arms and a carrier against his chest was James Silas Callahan, 6 weeks old, wide awake, looking at the mountain with an expression that a 6-week-old had no right to have focused and curious and already somehow like himself. Chloe reached the porch first. She looked at Silas for a moment, this woman who had fallen through his door, bleeding and terrified, and had come back 6 weeks later upright and whole, and she crossed the last few feet and hugged him carefully, aware of her side, but fully the way people hugged when they meant it entirely. He put his arms around her and let it happen. "You look good," he said when she stepped back. "I feel good." She said it with the specific emphasis of someone who had recently had extensive cause to feel the opposite. Surgical team said the field packing was the reason I didn't lose too much blood. They said whoever did it knew what they were doing. "They were extremely well supplied," Silas said. She laughed. "Still restocking every 4 months. Already did, last week." Tommy arrived beside them and extended his hand, and Silas shook it, and over Tommy's shoulder, the 40-odd members of the Arizona chapter stood in a loose grouping that was neither formal nor casual, but something specifically its own. The presence of people who had come somewhere because they chose to, because it mattered, because some things deserved to be shown up for in person. "We brought food," Tommy said. "Curtis made his chili. It's terrible, but he doesn't know that, so nobody say anything." "His chili is fine," Silas said. "It really isn't," Chloe said. "It genuinely isn't," said a voice from the back of the group, provoking a ripple of laughter, and Silas watched this happen, watched these people laugh together in the clearing in front of his cabin on a gold October afternoon, and felt something settle in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. Then Tommy held out the baby. "Here," he said simply. Silas took him. James Silas Callahan, 6 weeks old, approximately 7 pounds of concentrated life, looked up at Silas with those unfocused new person eyes that were still deciding what color they wanted to be. And Silas held him the way he'd held 61 newborns before, with the right support under the head, the slight angle that made them feel secure, the stillness that communicated to something in their nervous system that they were safe. James stopped moving, looked at Silas, and made a sound that was entirely formless and entirely content. "He does that," Chloe said softly. "When he feels safe, he just settles." Silas looked down at this child who carried his name in the middle of his and thought about Ruth and about the door he'd opened and about 40 years of going toward the thing everyone else ran from and about 11 years of solitude that had felt like peace and had also, he could admit this, now felt like waiting, though he hadn't known what he was waiting for. He's going to be something, Silas said. He already is, Tommy said. Behind them, Curtis had set up a folding table on the porch and was unpacking what appeared to be an industrial quantity of food, describing his chili to anyone within range, with the confidence of a man completely unaware of the consensus about it. Rita was arguing with him about the cornbread. Danny was sitting on the porch steps with Barnaby's head in his lap, scratching behind the dog's ears, with the automatic ease of someone who'd been doing it for weeks. Birch appeared at Silas's elbow. He looked at the baby. "You know what the guys started calling you?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "Doc," Birch said. "Not like a nickname exactly. Just that's who you are to them now, the doc on the mountain." A pause. "I figure you've been called worse." "Considerably worse," Silas said. "They talk about that night," Birch continued. "Not all the details, Tommy keeps some of that close. But the fact of it, what you did." He was quiet for a moment. "Some of these guys have been in places where nobody came for them. You understand what I mean? They grew up in places where help wasn't something that showed up." He nodded at the gathering in the clearing. "What you did, it means something particular to people like that." Silas looked out at them, at these men and women who move through the world carrying their history on their backs the way everyone carried their history, just more visibly in leather and patches, in the particular posture of people who had learned early that the world was not automatically on their side. He thought about Tommy Callahan crying in his kitchen when he found out he was going to be a father, about Danny asking what he wanted at 23, about Chloe walking a washed-out mountain road for a mile in a storm with a bullet in her side because she refused to let the night win. He thought about Ruth and about the 61 babies and about the door. "I didn't do it for meaning," Silas said. "I did it because it was right." "I know," Birch said. "That's why it means something to him." In the weeks after that visit, the mountain changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that disturbed the quiet Silas had built his life around, but in ways that were real and ongoing and reminded him daily that some things once shifted don't shift back. Curtis came every 3 weeks. He stopped pretending it was just about the groceries by the 4th visit, and they started having coffee together while he was there. And Silas learned that Curtis had a daughter in college, studying nursing, and a wife who made the actual good chili in the family, and that he'd been with the chapter for 19 years and had never once regretted it. Danny came when he could, which turned out to be more often than his schedule should have allowed. He and Barnaby had developed a relationship that operated entirely outside of Silas's authority, governed by its own rules and loyalties, and Silas accepted this with the grace of a man who understood that some bonds form themselves without being asked to. One evening in November, Danny sat on the porch with Silas as the sun was going down and said out of what appeared to be nowhere, "I signed up for EMT training." Silas looked at him. "Evening program, Phoenix Community College." Danny was looking at the trees, not at Silas. "I've been thinking about what you said, about knowing the difference between what you're good at and what you want." He paused. "I'm good at a lot of things, but I keep thinking about that night, about watching you work." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be able to do that." Silas didn't say anything for a moment. Let the statement stand on its own because it deserved to. "The EMT program at Phoenix Community College is solid," he said finally. "When you get to the airway management section, you call me. That's where most people develop bad habits, and bad habits in airway management kill people." Danny finally looked at him. "You'll help me?" "I'll help you." Something crossed Danny's face that was too real and too young for him to manage into neutrality in time, and then he looked back at the trees and nodded once the way young men nodded when they'd been given something they didn't know how to accept gracefully yet. Tommy called on the 15th of every month. It wasn't a scheduled call. It was simply what happened with the regularity of something that had become its own kind of pattern. They talked about James, who was growing with the aggressive enthusiasm of a child who seemed to understand that he'd arrived early and was making up for lost time. They talked about the cartel network, which was being dismantled piece by piece through a combination of methods that Tommy described in terms that left the specific mechanics pleasantly vague. They talked about nothing in particular, sometimes the weather, the road conditions, the hawk that Silas had started to recognize as the same one that appeared over the cabin on most mornings. On the last Tuesday of November, Tommy said, "Vicente Cruz's network officially ceased to exist this week. All the money, all the infrastructure, all the people gone." Silas was quiet for a moment. All of them. Everyone that mattered. A pause. The ones that didn't matter dispersed. They'll find other things to ruin. His voice was flat and final. But the specific threat, the people who paid for that night, they don't exist anymore. Is Chloe safe? Chloe has been safe since the morning after, Tommy said. She'll be safe for the rest of her life. He paused. So will you. Silas looked out at the mountain at the afternoon light, moving through the pines in the slow, golden way of late autumn, at the road that the chapter's men had repaired and which had held through 2 subsequent storms without complaint. I know, he said. And he did know. Not just as a statement Tommy made, but as a felt fact, the knowledge that the mountain which had always been his sanctuary had acquired a new quality. Not less quiet, not less solitary in the essential ways that he needed it to be, but protected, held, watched over by people who had made a permanent decision about who Silas Pendleton was to them and what that meant. On the first Sunday of December, the sun was doing something extraordinary with the afternoon light, the specific way it came through high, thin clouds and illuminated the world sideways, making ordinary things look briefly like something more than ordinary. Silas was on the porch. Barnaby was beside him, the dog's gray muzzle resting on his knee, breathing the slow and measured breath of an old animal at perfect peace. Silas had a cup of coffee. The book was open in his lap. He wasn't reading it. He was thinking about a knock at a door, about what it had cost him to answer it and what it had given back, about a woman who had fallen into his arms and a child who carried his name, and a man who had pointed a gun at his head and then put it away, and a dog who had understood before any of them that something important was happening. He was thinking about Ruth, who had always said that the best things in his life had arrived through inconvenient doors and that the only question was whether he was going to open them. He had opened this one. And on the other side of it, he had found at 72 years old, with his best years of medicine behind him and his mountain solitude intact and his 3-legged dog warm against his leg, that it was possible to be surprised by life, that the heart didn't finish its work just because you'd decided it was done, that courage didn't require a battlefield or a title or even an audience. Sometimes it just required a door and the willingness to answer it. Barnaby's tail moved once, a slow, contented sweep, and settled. Silas put his hand on the dog's back and felt the warmth of him. Down the mountain on the road that had been repaired by men who owed him something they couldn't repay, a hawk turned one last slow circle in the December sky and then set its wings and flew. Some men were built for solitude, and some were built for the fight, and the rarest ones, the ones history remembered. Not because they sought glory, but because they refused to look away, were built for the moment when the fight came to them unbidden and absolute. And they answered it not because they had to, but because everything they were made it impossible to do anything else. Silas Pendleton was that kind of man. He had always been that kind of man. And on a mountain in northern Arizona, in the weeks that followed the longest night of his retirement, the world finally knew it too.